Hi, this is Dan Bullard, retired electronics engineer, sitting down on the front deck of my houseboat again. We're getting there. We're 10 days away from the equinox, so yay! I can't wait for the summer to come back so I can go swimming. Let's hope I make it. But I want to talk about some fun things, mostly IQ. You know, I've read a lot of Darwin and a lot of Galton. Galton was Sir Francis Galton. He was Darwin's cousin, and Galton claimed that he could estimate somebody's IQ based on just their behavior and what they knew and the way they thought. And I've worked on doing that, and so I got pretty good at it, I think. And so I can estimate your IQ if I get to talk to you, not just like by what you're watching, but. And IQ is important. I've got an IQ of around 135. The Navy measured that, and that's why they recruited me in. They wouldn't let me go. They want to make sure they got a hold of me. My wife's got an IQ of 126, and guess what? She doesn't understand anything about this distortion stuff. So, you know, harmonics and distortion. If you find yourself having a difficult time understanding it, maybe it's because your IQ is too low. And, you know, the average IQ of a college graduate is something like 114, which really annoys my son when I talk like he's got a master's degree. And so he hates it when I talk about people who have degrees that are complete fucking idiots. But I'll tell you about a few that they're not so smart, they're not so stupid either. But when I first got started in mixed signal, I left GenRed and went to work for Credence, and my boss says, I want you to do this. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And it was mixed signal, you know. And so I got to work with a guy named John Sedor. Now John he was a nice guy, really nice guy. And very smart, relatively. But John was married 3 or 4 times, I think 4 times, and then he ended up dying. And so he did have some kids, but he was really good at analog, or presumably he was, you know, he did a lot of analog stuff. So he knew some stuff about op amps and other stuff. I don't think he knew what I knew about op amps, but he knew some stuff. So, but one time we were working on the factory floor, and he says, "Oh, this is the STS 5000." I'm like, "Oh, STS 5000." Now, I talk about the STS 3000 a lot. This is STS 5000, and the STS 5000 was basically 2 STS 3000 stacked up, one above the other. And so this stands about as high as you stand. It was as high as I stand. And so it's about 6 foot tall, and there's the test head, and you can see that it's a big machine. It's not a super big machine, but it's a pretty big machine. And basically what it is 2 19-inch racks stacked on top of each other. And so the STS 5000, he was showing me around the STS 5000, and it had all the instruments of an STS 3000, plus it had additional digital. I think it had up to 64 pins of digital. So you could do relatively high pin count digital mixed signal devices. Mixed signal, of course, means mixed analog and digital. But John was showing me around this STS 5000, and he showed me in the back was the back plane and the bus bars, because they had this huge friggin' power supplies, and these big 5 volt, 5.2 volt power supplies for the ECL and all the TTL and all that stuff. And he showed me the bus bars. He says, "Don't touch that. That's 5 volts at 200 amps." So I said, "You mean this?" And I touched it. 5 volts at 200 amps. What would 200 amps do to you? Well, it would cook you if it could get the current to flow through you, but 5 volts can't get anything flow through you at all, period. And I know because I worked on transmitters at HFT. And when I was in school in Great Lakes, back in Illinois, I had a my lab partner was from Kentucky. His name was Booth. He was hilarious. We were doing one of the labs that they had us doing, and he got on his hands and knees and got down there with a voltmeter to measure this voltage. And he didn't pay attention where he put his head, and he got across 10,000 volts with his voltmeter and got his hands on it. And that guy, he was 6 foot something, and he was, like I said, he was squatted down, and he shot across the room. He just his legs went just like a frog's leg, and he shot across the room and into the wall, and he actually put a dent in the wall. So we got shocked a lot. In fact, I had a policy, because I was a second class at HFT, I had a policy: if you get shocked, you're taking an hour off. You take an hour off, sit down, relax, have some coffee, whatever, calm down, because it's bad for you. Getting shocked with 20,000 volts, because our power supplies on the HF transmitters, those were 20,000 volts at 6 amps. Now, can you imagine what 20,000 volts at 6 amps would do to you? It would cook you alive. And it happened. That stuff happened to people. There was a guy who worked on those things. He got across the input power, which was 440 3-phase. He got his hand in there and got a hold of it, and it cooked him alive. So you don't want to do that. So, but John, he's like, don't touch that, because that's 5 volts at 200 amps. You mean like this? When I touch it, and 5 volts can't do anything to you, because your body has a fairly high resistance. Now, I just measured my resistance, and I had to change the battery on my ohm meter. This is a battery that came with it. And generally what I do with these, you stick it on your tongue. And if it's really good, if it's powerful, it'll shock your tongue. Why is that? Well, why did I get my meter out? So I could measure the resistance of my tongue. My tongue was about 200 k ohms, wet, 200 k ohms. And so a good 9-volt battery would get you about 45 microamps of current, about 50 microamps of current. So take a good 9-volt battery, put it across your tongue. That's what 50 microamps tastes like. And I say taste because that's what it is, it's a taste. But John didn't, he was a smart guy, but he thought that 200 amps meant 200 amps was going to flow through you. No, 5 volts, to get 200 amps to flow through you, yeah, the power supply was capable of putting out 200 amps, but the 5 volts can't get 200 amps to flow through you unless you're dead short. So, that's not going to happen, You'd have to be, 5 volts divided by 200 amps? You'd have to have a very, very, very low resistance. And this is a smart guy. John, he was a pretty smart guy. Of course, he was married 4 times, so he wasn't that smart. I've been married for 43 years to one woman. So we get along just great. It was his fault every time. He cheated on his last wife. I introduced him to his last wife that got, she's the gal who actually hired me at Credence. She was the HR lady. She hired me at Credence, and I introduced her to John after a while when we were back in Boston. And they danced, and they had a good time, and they ended up getting married. And then he cheated on her. So, just because you're smart doesn't mean you're smart enough to stay out of trouble. I'm smart enough to stay out of trouble. I never cheat on my wife. Never would I do that, ever. Because I gave her a gun. She knows how to use it, too. So, take risks like that, So, John was a smart guy, but he wasn't that smart. Other guys I worked with, you hear me talk about David Reynolds, Daver. I talk about Daver all the time. And I tested him. I got into an IQ kick. Like I said, I read Galton and all this stuff. And Daver, I knew he had a pretty high IQ. and I wanted to find out. And so I gave him an IQ test. 45 minutes later, we found out he had an IQ of 145. So he's got 10 IQ points on me. But still, David believes in global warming, okay? And so I brought up the point of, Glacier Girl. The Lost Squadron landed in, I think it was Greenland, in World War II, 1943 or something. They got lost, and they decided just to sit down and get out of there. And so they landed, and they left their planes, and they got away, and the snowstorm buried their planes. And just a few years ago, they found them with radar, ground penetrating radar, and they dug a hole down through the ice and pulled them up 300 feet below the ice. So 300 feet of ice on top of those planes. And he claims that, global warming is melting the ice. Oh, really, David? Come on. Well, how come that ice didn't melt? 300 feet of ice on top of Glacier Girl. And they dug a hole and they pulled Glacier Girl out piece by piece and rebuilt her up on the surface, and now she's flying around again. But if the glaciers are melting, they're melting from the bottom. Well, that's not my fault, David. I didn't hear you heat up the ground. That's up to the earth. If the ground wants to heat up, that's somebody else's business, not mine. You better talk to God. But if the ice is melting on the surface, that might be due to, the atmosphere, but not if it's melting from below. So we know when those planes landed, 1943, and we know that, whatever it is, 50 years, 60 years later, there was 300 feet of ice on her. So that ice is not melting. So just because you're smart doesn't mean you're a genius. You're going to solve everything. But I didn't get a good review out of David. The thing is, now I can't talk to him anymore. We used to talk about DSP and all kinds of stuff, and now he's like, don't talk to me about harmonics, because I go on and on about harmonics. Who would have thunk it? Another guy I knew, I had quit Maxim. I worked for Maxim for a while. 2008, I quit Maxim, and I took off like 4 years, and we did all kinds of fun things with this houseboat. We cruised all over the area in this houseboat and had a really good time. But it was getting to the point where I needed to add that third pontoon, the one that's right down there. So I started looking for work, and I went on LinkedIn, and I got a call from Tektronix. They wanted to ask me about a guy named Evan Belt. Now, Evan was a guy that I knew at Credence. He must have put me down on his references. And people are fishing, so just ignore them. They're going by in a minute. He put me on his references, and so they asked me about Evan. I'm like, oh yeah, Evan's smart. Evan's the guy who did the calibration and the diagnostics for the VI-8, which was on the Vista. And so there's that boat. So the VI-8 was a VI, force voltage, programmable force voltage or programmable force current, and measure voltage current, and it had a programmable memory. You could program the memory to measure voltage, measure current, measure voltage, current, whatever you want to do. You could set up a micro-instruction memory, and it would store those values in the memory, and then you can retrieve them. And he had to do the calibration, and on the Vista, they had a calibration station, so you docked the test head. Remember, I showed you that picture of the STS-5000. It had a test head. All these testers have a test head. They're not little boxes, like the spectrum analyzers or scopes that some of these dickheads, especially at Tektronix, got. It had a real test head. And so to calibrate it, you had to dock the test head to a calibration station, which had GPIB control from the tester. The tester would run a program, and it would control the GPIB to make this thing probe various points on the tester, on the test head, and it would measure voltages and currents and do all kinds of stuff. So that's how they calibrated those things. And you dock it, and it would take like 2 hours to calibrate. And if the tester had a VI8, it ran Evan's code. So Evan had to write the code for calibration and for, that's the weight for it would measure the voltages and currents from the VI8, and it would calibrate it so it made it very, very, very accurate. All of the instruments on the on the Credence VistaVision and Vista Duo and Vista Quartet, they're all calibrated by this calibration station. And so that was kind of a cool thing. It was nice, traceable. You could send stuff out. You could send it, like it had an HP 3457 or 3458 meter in it. So you could send that off and have it calibrated and all this stuff. It was all calibrated. So Evan wrote the calibration for that, and he wrote the diagnostics. Generally, you would use the calibration stations, run diagnostics on it, but it had some diagnostics that could run without the calibration station. So Evan was a pretty smart guy, and I worked with him at Credence on the VI8 and quite a few things. Very smart guy. And so I worked with him. I recommended him for a job at Tektronix because he had applied for a job at Tektronix. So he got the job, and then a couple months later, I got him to recommend me for a job at Tektronix because he had a test engineering position there. So he recommended me to work at Tektronix. So I worked at Tektronix with him. And really fun thing, me and Evan, we got along great. We would go to lunch. Very often what would happen is, they had a cafeteria on the Tektronix campus. It was a big campus. They had a cafeteria there, and so I would leave my area, go over to Evan's building, stop by Evan's office to pick him up, and then we'd go over to the cafeteria and have lunch and talk about stuff. Sometimes I'd just go over there and we would walk around. There was a path around the building. We would walk around and talk, and we had a good relationship. He told me he had an IQ of 145, and I believed him. The Galton thing, I could tell. He was pretty smart. And sometimes I would go to his office getting ready to go to lunch, and he'd be busy, but he knew that, 11:30 was time to go to lunch with Dan. So I would show up at his office, and if he wasn't really there, if he wasn't available, I would wait for him. And so one time I was at his office, I was waiting for him, and I looked at some of his books, and he just bought, it was a new purchase, he had just bought a book on the FFT, and I'm like, Evan, how come you don't know about the FFT yet? Why would you buy a book on the FFT? Now remember, when I volunteered at Vancouver Community Library, I did a book nook blog on a Ramirez book on the FFT, and I've never read it. I've read parts of it. I don't really need to read it because I know the FFT so well. I've written an FFT. Well, I stole one off the internet. I copied it over, and I went through it, made sure that it did what I wanted to do. And I understood the FFT very, very, very well. And I used an FFT. I used that FFT to prove out my windowing article. And so that's how I did windowing when I was at Maxim. That was cool. But I couldn't believe that Evan had a book on the FFT. I'm like, Evan, how come you don't know everything there is to know about the FFT? I do. I don't know why you need a book on the FFT. Now, admittedly, you can learn things from books about things that you think you know. And I admitted to Daver one time that I had a book on XML. And I really, really like XML. And he's like, you had a book on XML? Who needs a book on XML? Same attitude I had about the FFT. XML is really easy to understand. I mean, anybody can figure it out. But there's a lot of things about XML that a lot of people don't know. And this book had a whole chapter on stuff that people don't know about the XML application. And I told him, well, did you know that you can do this with XML? Oh, I didn't know that. David told me that. So, I don't, if you want to read a book about XML or FFTs or whatever, go ahead, be my guest. Maybe learn something. But I learned what I need to know about the FFT by doing an FFT. And I've done FFTs on the SCS 3000, the SCS 5000, the Creedence Vista Duo Quartet, on the Schlumberger S9000 EXA, on the XL. I know the FFT very, very well, and it's pretty much the FFT is pretty much equally the same all over the place, except that the FFT on XL has some really nice features that most other FFTs don't have. Now, it takes a long time. That's a problem because it's interpretive. It's not compiled code. It's a macro. So it's not compiled code, so it takes a long time. As I mentioned, normally takes me about 45 minutes to do an FFT on some application on Excel. But you generally don't. Me, I'm retired. I can sit around and do nothing for 45 minutes and go check. Oh yeah, there, it's got the result for me. But Evan, who had an IQ of 145, he needed a book on the FFT. Then I see the boat going by. Hello. Some kind of fisherman going by. It's a Saturday, so you'd expect that. So, if you don't have an IQ of at least 125, at least, like I said, my wife has an IQ of 126, and she listens to me about FFTs and harmonics and all stuff, but it doesn't really sink in. I really can't get it. Now, she's a girl, maybe that makes a difference, but if you don't have an IQ of at least 130, 135, you're probably barking up the wrong tree, You're not going to understand harmonics. You're not going to understand FFTs. You're not going to understand it the way I understand it. Now, I mentioned I have friends. I have a good friend, or had a good friend, that had a very high IQ. I don't know, it might have been 150. Jeff Caston. And he was into RF and Bluetooth, even before Bluetooth was really a thing. And he was a really great guy. He died of brain cancer when he was relatively young. He was in his 40s. John Cedar died of brain cancer. Pretty smart guy. Died of brain cancer in his late 50s, early 60s. So, really smart people die of brain cancer, which is bad. Jeff Caston, he was brilliant guy. He didn't really do the stuff that I did, but he did RF, and that's why I thought RF was such a big deal, because Caston, he was smart and he knew RF and all that stuff. So I thought, you got to be really smart to know RF. Well, kind of. And Jeff Caston, he was not as smart as he could have been. He had one kid, one daughter. And I kept telling Caston, look, man, you need to have another daughter. Then you can form a band. We'll call you Jeff Caston and the Castonettes. But no, he had one daughter, and we went to his funeral. It was very sad. Died of brain cancer. Do smart people die of brain cancer because working too much? I don't know. Who knows? I haven't died of brain cancer yet. Daver hasn't died of brain cancer yet. But Cedar and Caston, yeah, they died of brain cancer. So, who knows? Maybe, I don't know. But if you're not smart, you're not going to understand anything I'm talking about. So just go away, go, drop your subscription, go somewhere else. You don't need to be watching me. I had a comment on one of my videos. Great backdrop, yeah, it is great. But, if you're not smart, it's a waste of your time. It really is a waste of your time. So I really hope you have a high IQ, and if you don't, well, you better move on. I don't think I can help you. I really don't. If you don't understand harmonics, If you don't understand mixed signal, if you don't understand DACs and ADCs and linearity and all that stuff, you're barking up the wrong tree. Go do something else, you know. Go hang out with Tony. Anyway, that's enough, you know. So, anyway, 50 microamps from a 9-volt battery. Just remember that. That's the one thing you can remember. Otherwise, move along. So once again, from the river, this is Dan Bullard. See you later.